Hello, and thank you for joining the third in this webinar series hosted by Cardinal Commerce. Today's topic is Solution Design and Implementation Considerations for 3D Secure. I'm Paul Harrison. I'm Head of Sales, Productivity and Business Development at Cardinal. On a practical note, please be aware that there will be plenty of time towards the end of the webinar for you to address any questions that you might have and for us to answer those questions. So please do use the chat box that you see on the screen in front of you, and we look forward to addressing those questions. Now, I do notice that we have callers in from different global regions, so we're delighted you can all join, and I just wish you a good morning, afternoon, and evening. Now, I would like to introduce my very special guest, Kevin Crockett, who is the Senior Director of Global Customer Services here at Cardinal Commerce. Kevin really is the ideal guest for today's topic, as he leads the team that oversees the 3D Secure implementation for all Cardinal merchants, right from small, medium-sized businesses right through to global enterprise corporations. So you're very welcome, Kevin. Today's discussion is really all about 3DS integration from a merchant's perspective. And so we'll be covering all the things that merchants should consider before they even implement 3D Secure, as well as addressing what merchants should do if they are on 3D Secure today, the old version, but want to upgrade to the new version, EMV 3D Secure. We will also be providing advice on what merchants should be looking for in the ideal authentication provider. However, to kickstart things, I think it might be helpful to provide a very brief overview of the benefits and opportunities that EMV 3D Secure brings to the digital payments industry. So it's clear that the demand for 3D Secure is increasing significantly, but what is driving this? Well, there's a number of market forces at play. First of all is that there's certainly an ongoing migration from point of sale to card not present. Now, that's hardly surprising to our listeners today, as it's clear that merchants are conducting more and more of their business in an e-commerce environment. But there has also been an unprecedented migration of fraud from that point of sale environment to the electronic commerce environment. One of the triggers for that was the introduction of the chip card. And with that, we noticed almost overnight a significant reduction in fraud in the point of sale world, thanks to the chip card. But then that left the fraudsters needing to look for another area, a path of less resistance. And so right in front of their eyes was this very attractive, booming card not present market. And so we saw a migration of fraud from the POS sector to the card not present environment. So that's been one challenge we've seen. Along with that has been the approval gap, the challenge that the issuers and merchants face with that. What do we mean by that approval gap? Well, in essence, if you think in a point of sale market, a card present market, typically the approval rates are around 98%. Now, that can vary depending on many factors, including the region of the country or the vertical or the specifics of the transaction itself. But by and large, about 98% approval rate. In a card not present environment, however, that's significantly lower, around 85%. So that creates a major challenge for the key players within the ecosystem. Good orders are potentially being lost. So in essence, merchants and banks need additional tools to fight fraud as well as approve more transactions. Another market force at play is 3D Secure mandates, and specifically regional and network mandates. So 3DS network mandates are come about when a specific credit card network requires transactions, specific transactions, to be authenticated prior to authorization. An example of that might be in Brazil, for example. Visa requires 3DS for all e-commerce transactions there. So it's specific to the credit card network, not necessarily the entire ecosystem as a whole. The regional networks are just that. They are, or the regional mandates are just that. They are mandates that are implemented at a regional or a country level across all the credit card networks. So an example of that is in India today, or of course the upcoming PSD2 regulation in the European area that will require all European acquired business transactions to be supportive of strong customer authentication. And 3D Secure is seen as the most pragmatic means of supporting SCA. And then the final market force at play is the updated protocol for 3D Secure. Let's jump into that just a little bit further. So what's so good about this second generation of 3DS, known now as EMV 3D Secure? Well, in essence, it addresses the issues and the problems associated with the original 3DS 1.0 version, and then some. So EMV 3D Secure is designed fundamentally with the consumer experience in mind. So the consumer experience is really the backbone to the whole architecture. And the result is that transactions that pass through 3D Secure in the new protocol do so much more quickly. For consumers, it now does not matter what type of device they use. So whether they are transacting on their desktop or using a smartphone, a smart TV, a tablet, or indeed any IoT device, such as a virtual digital assistant like Amazon's Alexa, it doesn't matter. The new protocol is supportive of all these devices. So again, much more consumer friendly. And then we should not forget, at the same time, the issuing landscape is evolving. And that's particularly significant for non-mandated regions. And what do we mean by this? Well, today, for example, in the US, the majority of transactions are now being authenticated behind the scenes by risk-based issuing banks. So the consumer is oblivious to the fact that they are being authenticated. It's seamless. And only in the riskiest of situations will the issuing bank pose a challenge in the form of a step-up. And then last but not least, additional data elements. So the new protocol now ensures that many more fields of data are appended to each transaction. And this addresses the challenge that I mentioned just a few moments ago, the authorization gap. So now the issuing bank is in receipt of more data, which arms them with a much better risk assessment of the transaction and increases the likelihood of approving more good transactions. So that's EMV 3D Secure at a high level. Just added to that, I think it's worth noting that EMVCo, which is the formal body that now has the responsibility of managing and keeping up to date the 3DS protocol, has committed to doing so in the future. In other words, they are committed to making sure that the protocol remains updated in the future. So as technology arrives and as the ecosystem generally becomes more updated, we can rest assured that the 3DS protocol will keep up to speed as well. So for example, today, 2.1 is already in effect, and then EMV 3DS 2.2 will be available in the next few months. Now, 2.2 will support strong customer authentication exemption flags. So that's particularly pertinent to, for example, the PSD2 regulation that will come into effect. And may only be of interest to or of value to the larger enterprise merchants and acquirers and gateways. but this is something that you should certainly discuss with your 3DS provider. And then the last thing I'll say is that the credit card networks themselves are starting to do their bit to encourage more adoption. In essence, they are implementing deadlines by when the merchants, the acquirers, the gateways, as well as the issuing banks need to support EMV 3D Secure. Kevin, did you want to add anything to any of that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's a great overview and provides great context for the audience. And really, the way that I look at it is that 3DS is a mechanism for a merchant and an issuer to exchange data about a cardholder or customer prior to authorization. So in 3DS 1.0, that pipe between those two systems had a limited amount of data that could flow through it. And a lot of the key benefits you talked about in version 2.1 and 2.2, we've increased the amount of data that can be exchanged. So that therefore in turn increases the issuer's confidence in their decisions, which leads to higher approvals. And then during the 3DS authentication flow, less need for interaction with the cardholders during the session. So more frictionless, seamless authentication, which provides a much cleaner user experience.
Yeah. And that really just summarizes what I was going to say here in the next slide, in the sense that it's a benefit to all, both in terms of the merchants and the issuers and the shoppers, the consumers, because it's helping to reduce fraud, but also importantly, close that authorization gap, all while minimizing the friction in the consumer's mind. So that's all very well and good. The merchants are now needing and wanting to implement 3D Secure. In reality, what should they be considering before they go through this whole implementation process?
Sure. Yeah, that's a nice segue here into the next topic. So really what I'm going to be going through over the next couple of slides here is really what are the things that you as a merchant should be considering when you're looking at implementing 3D Secure. So maybe you're already using 3DS today and you're wondering, okay, what version am I on? Do I need to upgrade? Maybe you are not using 3DS in any fashion today, so you're just wondering, where do I start? Those are the things that we're going to walk through in detail. What are the steps that you should be taking? What are the different things that you should really be thinking about? And then also we can address any questions that come up along the path here. So first off, at a high level, implementation considerations for 3DS. One is liability shift and liability protection. So when a transaction is successfully authenticated, you as a merchant would then be protected from fraudulent chargebacks if one were to be issued for that transaction, because you ran 3DS, the issuer validated the identity of their cardholder, so you are therefore protected. So that's one of the key benefits of running these 3D Secure authentication programs. So it's a key consideration to take into effect. What type of business case are you looking to build? Where are your fraud rates currently today? And then also, what other tools are you using to help combat fraud? Because while you're not financially liable for the transaction and the fraud, you as a merchant are still responsible for it. So that reported fraud still does count against your overall fraud rates. So it's still very important to, even if you're using 3DS, to make sure you're leveraging other tools that complement the solution in order to keep your fraud rates down. Next, adapting to a changing marketplace. I think, Paul gave a great overview on kind of our transition from 3DS 1.0 to 2.1 to 2.2. So it's important to consider, what are the different purchase journeys that you're putting your customers through today? What type of devices and channels are you, taking orders on? And how do you plan on injecting authentication into those different workflows and scenarios? And then finally, research on providers. There's a lot of different 3DS providers in the market, Cardinal being one of them. So what are the things that you should really be taking into consideration? What are the important questions that you want to be asking your providers to make sure that you're making the most informed, educated decision on choosing a provider that will meet all of the needs of your business?
I think that's something that you're going to dive into in more detail in a few minutes, correct?
Correct, yes.
Wonderful.
So choosing an implementation method that fits your business. So you may be thinking, how do I go about even doing research on 3D Secure providers? How do I go about selecting one of them? So really, you can take a look at how you're currently processing payments today. So are you hooked into a PSP or an aggregator? Do you have a gateway? Are you using a shopping cart plugin to take orders on your site? A lot of these different providers have 3DS baked into their solutions that can be enabled. A lot of them use a 3DS provider in the background like Cardinal. So understanding, how you're taking orders today, what options do those companies have, and then a lot of times it can just be an easy on-off switch where you're able to just enable 3DS on your site. You can also just do a direct connection to a 3D Secure service provider, where if you're managing your own site, you have your own checkout flows, you can just bake in the implementation directly into your website, and then that way you have full control and the ability to manage all of the various authentication flows and the underlying, consumer experience behind it. So really puts you in the driver's seat on being able to, control that UX as much as possible.
Sure. And I think for those merchants who might be availing of this through a third party, it goes without saying they should make sure that even if their provider is today, their gateway, for example, today has 3D Secure, to make sure that it is EMV 3D Secure, not just the 1.0 version, correct?
Correct. Yes, that's definitely one of the key considerations is that you want to do one implementation for 3D Secure. You don't want to maintain multiple different integration methods that you need to know what version the issuer is supporting. With a solution like Cardinals, it's one implementation, and then we do all of the heavy lifting on the protocol routing and understanding what the rest of the market's doing, what the ecosystem's doing, and then we'll choose the right rails to send the transaction down. And that's an important consideration to make because on the merchant side, you don't want to have to manage the complexity of the different routing capabilities. So that's a key thing to ask your solution provider. How do you handle routing between the various versions of the 3DS protocol?
Yeah, because it is fluid, certainly at this time.
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
All right, so let's say you're not using 3DS today. So what are some of the key steps that you should be taking? So step one, you really want to work with the 3DS provider to understand how authentication would look in your purchase flow. So you really want to be engaged with experts who can comb through your various purchase journeys, whether you're solely browser-based or you have a native mobile application or you have a heavy presence on just generic kind of web view transactions. So really getting deep into the solution design aspect of understanding what are the different use cases that we need to account for, and then how do we want to apply the implementation to each use case to further optimize the consumer experience and make sure that things are being done in the right sequence. We're addressing things like latency and making sure that we're firing all the various calls at the right times. So really that's something your 3DS service provider should be able to walk you through and really put together a solution design for you that you can then go and implement. So that's really step one. Step two would then be to identify your current pain points. So where are you seeing fraud come in today? This would be a great time to kind of do some baseline or benchmarks on some of your key KPIs. So what are your fraud rates in the various markets that you transact in? What are your approval rates? You can even get down to an issuer or a bin level. Really take a snapshot of how your business is performing today so that you can measure the impact that 3DS then has after you've gone and implemented it. So this is a key thing, again, that your solution provider can help you on establishing what are those KPIs and benchmarks that we want to evaluate, and then make sure that we have the right tracking and mechanisms in place to make sure that we're achieving the desired ROI.
Sure. And certainly through our experience working with merchants, it can be one or both of those KPIs. Typically, that is the driving force, whether it's fraud for certain markets, certain verticals, whereas other merchants, they may not have a real concern about fraud levels, but they are really focused on trying to optimize their approval rates, correct?
Correct, yes. And that kind of bleeds into the next point here where we're talking about working with your 3DS provider to create a custom-tailored authentication strategy that meets the needs of your business. So maybe you have key KPIs in a certain geographic market that you want to drive out fraud. Whereas in other locations or regions, maybe you're more focused on approval rates. But you also do business in Europe, so you know that you need to adhere to the SCA regulations set forth by PSD2. So you'll likely have a very different strategy in each of those markets. In some markets, potentially you're looking to achieve higher levels of frictionless authentication, so not wanting to support a lot of challenges or user experience on your site. And then in other markets where there are mandates, you will need to take that into account, and you will need to make sure that you have the ability to meet the regulations and comply so that your business isn't impacted when these regulations start going into effect. So that's another thing that, if you're working with the right service provider, they can understand kind of market by market what is the best strategy that meets your needs and what you're looking to achieve by implementing 3DS.
Right, because it could be a merchant who's not just operating in one region or one country. It could be a merchant that's has business in the US, but also in Europe and in other markets. And as you said, some of those markets, they might be mandated. So that's one strategy that needs to be followed. But then it could be a very different strategy to how you optimize 3D Secure, minimizing friction, taking into account all the market dynamics. Yeah,
that's correct.
Yeah.
Yep. And then lastly, and what we're going to go into more detail in the next slide is you have to go and you implement this solution. So depending on the pathway that you're taking to implement 3DS, if you're hooked into a shopping cart or a gateway that offers 3DS as more of a plugin, it's much simpler. It's more of just kind of a turn on or turn off type thing. If you're doing a direct connection, typically that would take somewhere between 1 and 3 months from solution design all the way through full launch and validation, based on the complexity of your site and based on the complexity of the implementation that you're looking to introduce. So we can definitely go into some more detail on the next slide here. So how to get started. So we know that we want to implement 3DS. Let's say we just want to do a direct connection into a 3DS server provider. So what are the steps that we should be taking? Step one here, I have outlined, just talk to your acquirer. Make sure that they're aware that you're planning on implementing 3DS. As a part of the 3DS workflow, there are new fields that need to be passed in authorization. So there's an electronic commerce indicator, and there's what's called a cardholder authentication verification value, which is basically the cryptogram that comes back from the issuer that ultimately drives that liability protection, that key benefit of running 3DS. So there are new fields that need to be passed within authorization. So you want to get dialed in with your acquirer to make sure that they're aware they can configure your accounts correctly to be able to pass those fields. And a lot of times they'll want to do like a formal certification to make sure that when you launch 3DS that you're still able to process payments successfully and that all of the data is getting passed downstream correctly. So next, or in tandem, you're working with your 3DS server to identify what implementation methods are available. So speaking from Cardinal standpoint, supporting both browser, app, IoT, we have a multitude of solutions. For browser, we have JavaScript and API-based solutions. We have native app SDKs for iOS and Android. So here's where you're really getting into the details of how you're going to implement, what method you want to use. Some merchants, it's their preference, whether they want kind of an all-encompassing JavaScript, kind of set it and forget it, and just let 3DS run organically. Other merchants choose for these more hybrid/API integration approaches, just because that's how they're used to doing things and that's how their technology works. So really make sure that your provider is able to, have some degree of flexibility in how they implement the solution. So that makes the actual, integration much easier on the merchant side.
So just on that, if I'm a merchant and I'm conducting business both in the browser as well as through native app, I will need to consider then, is it two separate integrations or?
Yeah, so if you're doing native app transactions, then yeah, you would have a native app SDK that you would ingrain into your actual app. And then you would have either the JavaScript or API-based solutions that would be running for your browser transactions. So next, we want to determine, what type of information and data do you want to send as a part of the authentication flow. So this goes back to the earlier point around the transition from 1.0 to 2.1 and eventually 2.2 is that there's a plethora of new fields that can be sent in authentication for a variety of different reasons. So there's a set of core required fields. So for example, browser and device data, the card details, amount, email, IP, billing address. Those are the core required fields that you would need just to enable EMB 3DS. So that in itself is a lot more data than available in the 1.0 version of the protocol. So right there off the bat, the issuer has more information to make a better decision, which should lead to more frictionless authentication user experiences. The other key things that you want to evaluate are what are the conditional or optional fields that are available in the specification. So there are some conditionally required fields. For example, if you're doing recurring payments or installments, if you want to take advantage of 3RI transactions, there are different sets of fields that would then become required to support those workflows, supporting things like non-payment authentications for card ad type situations, all things that you want to consider. So this is really where having that key understanding of what use cases are you looking to support. So do you have guest checkout and card on file, and you want to run 3DS when people are adding their cards to the wallet? This is really where we're getting into the next level of detail, and your 3DS provider should be able to walk you through field by field. Here's what it means. We think these things apply to your business based on what we know about it, and that this kind of goes into that custom design, solution design process that our teams go through. The other things to consider here are some of the exemption management fields that have been added to the spec. So if you do transact in the EEA and you are in scope of the PSD2 mandates that are coming, there are additional fields in version 2.2 that allow you to take various exemptions. So exemptions is a very hot topic in PSD2. So understanding what are those fields, when do you need to be sending them, how do you need to populate them? Again, your 3DS provider should be walking you through all of those things.
And that's where really the devil is in the detail, as you said, especially what we're facing now with the PSD2 regulation. There's potentially exemptions, but there's a lot of nuance, and that's where a good 3DS provider will help you navigate through that.
Correct, yes. And then there's a whole other set of data, just optional risk indicator fields that can be sent in. So these aren't a part of the protocol today, but additional information that you as a merchant can choose to send, like how long has this account been opened, or is this a ship to store or ship to address scenario, or when was the last time the password was changed? All of these different little nuggets of information that we're trying to get over into these issuers' hands to further strengthen their model. So we're at a point now where we're understanding what all of this data means and what is the actual impact behind them. So there's just a lot of different things that can be taken into consideration as far as, okay, what do I need to send in order to initiate an EMB 3DS transaction and make sure that I'm providing my customers the best possible user experience.
Right. What do I need? What's the bare minimum? But then also, what's in the interest of my customer?
Correct.
As you said, get more. You can't almost send too much information to the issuing bank because, of course, they've got that ongoing challenge of being able to make that educated risk assessment.
Right. The more information that they have, the higher degree of likelihood that they are going to use a frictionless authentication experience, which is the best case for everyone.
Yep.
And then the more information that they have, the more confidence they'll have in authorization to then go and approve that transaction, because they know as a part of 3DS, they did all of this validation, they received all of this data. So now when you go to approve the transaction, they feel much more confident about it. Yep. So from there, you have your solution design done. You know what data you're going to send. You have all of your use cases outlined. You then go and implement and then validate the solution. So this is where you are working with your 3DS provider to actually write the code, to download the SDKs, run through all of the various test cases and certifications. You're working with your acquirer to test the new fields that need to be sent in authorization. So here's where kind of really the heavy lifting from an implementation standpoint comes into play. And then from there, you really monitor and optimize. So you get to a point to where I've done the work, the code is out there, I'm sending the fields, I've validated that everything's working correctly. Now you're taking a look at, okay, previously when I set my benchmark KPIs, now we're taking a look at, okay, we've implemented 3DS. Now how are things performing? What is the impact that 3DS is having on my business? And then do we need to make adjustments to the rules that we're running or the data sets that we're sending? And so it's a continuous, optimization exercise.
Yeah, and that's really critical, isn't it? That post-implementation monitoring and support that a good 3DS provider will certainly provide, because as you said, it's not just a case of getting ready and turning it on. There's tweaking that could be required afterwards, with the whole objective of optimizing the performance.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So let's say you're using 3DS today. You've been using it for some time now. You implemented it a couple of years ago. So you're wondering, okay, what do I need to be thinking of? I'm already using it. What are my next steps here? What am I trying to take from this webinar? So really the first step that I would personally take is do a quick audit on your entire digital commerce strategy. So since you implemented 3DS, and kind of what key changes have happened? Did you previously only take orders on the web and now you have an app that you've released? Is your business facing new challenges? Did you do a redesign of your website implementation where you went to a responsive design and you kind of want to revamp what that user experience looks like? Are there new regulations coming up in markets that you transact in? Do you now transact in new markets that you didn't when you initially implemented 3DS? So there's a lot of things that you want to take into consideration and really do an inventory of where you're doing 3DS today, and where you might want to be doing it or need to be doing it in the future. So the next step then would be to check your 3D Secure implementation. So chances are if you've been using 3DS for a couple of years, you're not on one of the latest and greatest solutions that supports all of the future versions of the protocol. So if you are on an older version of your 3DS implementation, again, this is where you would want to get hooked in with your service provider and understand what is the gap analysis between what I'm doing today and where I need to go in order to fully support EMV 3DS. So then that becomes a very similar solution design exercise that we talked about before for net new 3DS users. You would still go through that process if you're using 3DS today. So, from Cardinal standpoint, you're on a legacy API-based solution. Well, we now have, 3 JavaScript-based implementation methods. We have native app SDKs. So really kind of revamping that whole solution design and making sure that we're touching all of the use cases and addressing all of the needs that you have. Next, again, reviewing your fraud strategy and tasks. So this would be, again, taking a look at those key KPIs and the performance. So what are your fraud rates? How has 3DS been working? What are your approval rates? Where are the areas that you really want to focus on? And really do an inventory of some of the other fraud tools that you're using. So 3DS is meant to be a complementary solution. So are you using the tools together? And are you architecting the solution in a way that, the insight that you're getting from 3DS is then cascaded into the other risk assessments that you may be doing? So really just taking an inventory of everything you're doing from a fraud mitigation standpoint.
Yeah.
And then lastly, again, getting dialed in with your acquirer, letting them know, hey, we've been running 3DS. We're looking at upgrading to, 3DS version 2 or EMV 3DS. Based on the network, there are some additional fields that would need to be sent in authorization. So there may be some changes to that part of the workflow. So again, you just want to make sure that they're engaged sooner rather than later, because you may need to go through kind of a recertification, if you will, from an acquirer standpoint, just to make sure that your data integrity is on point and you're sending all of the data in the correct format and you're getting all of the actual protection and benefits of running the program.
Right. So I think there's an underlying message here that for those merchants who might already be using the legacy 3D Secure, don't just keep going with that. Really, there's a lot of benefit, as we've already highlighted, in adopting the new generation of 3D Secure, whether the merchant operates in a mandated region or outside. because ultimately we're trying to reduce the fraud and increase the authorization rates, but minimize that friction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
So we've talked a lot about EMV 3DS and 2.1 and 2.2, and I think at least in my experience with our customers that there's some confusion out there as to how ready is the ecosystem actually for EMV 3DS, and I think that there's a notion or perception that it's really not actually here. It's still something that's out in the future. So what do I really need to be doing today to get ready for it? So quick plug here, we actually do have a webinar coming up on the 4th, which will go into a lot more detail on all of the various timelines and deadlines. So that's scheduled for March 4th. So you'll see some more details from us on that in the upcoming weeks here. But quickly to kind of go over at a high level from a timeline standpoint, EMV 3DS has been in production for about the past 12 to 18 months. So each network, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, they have their EMV 3DS directory servers up and running. Issuers have been loading card ranges and starting to participate in EMV 3DS. MasterCard has recently globally enabled EMV 3DS on their side, so they have their global stand-in smart authentication server. So the notion or the idea that I don't need to do anything now because EMV 3DS isn't here yet, that's actually not the case. And especially if you're in a regulated market like Europe, with PSD2 coming, you want to be on EMV 3DS version 2.1 and 2.2, and there are strict enforcement dates that the networks have in place to make sure that the issuers are also following suit and they're also migrating on their side. So long story short here, the time is now to really start thinking about these things.
Yeah.
So I would suggest that everyone signs up for the next webinar as well too, just to make sure that you can get all of the details at a very network issuer specific level.
Correct, because just latching on to that last point you made about the PSD2 regulation, it comes into effect at the end of December 2020, so 11 months in essence, UK being an exception just a couple of months later, mid-March 2021. But as you indicated, the credit card networks are starting to implement deadlines prior to that because they recognize that it's going to take time for all the different parties to be prepared and ready.
Right. And you want to implement the solution and then be able to test it and optimize it and tweak it as needed. So there's a good runway that we have the extensions that were granted. So now is a good time to start thinking about those things.
Don't put it on the long finger.
Yes. So authentication is a part of your overall fraud strategy. I think we touched on this in the previous slide a bit, but just wanted to quickly dive into it again here that there is no silver bullet to combat all fraud. 3DS is one mechanism that you can have in your fraud toolkit, but it's very important that you're layering it in as a part of your overall fraud strategy. So if you're using other risk management tools, ensure that you're working with that provider and your 3DS provider to understand how do you feed data between those two systems. So how do you take the output of 3DS, which runs prior to authorization, and inject that into a downstream risk management tool like Decision Manager, for example, and leverage that data to run different rule sets. So what we don't want to do is implement 3DS and then every time we get liability protection on a transaction, just send it to authorization, because remember, although you're not financially liable for the fraudulent chargeback, you're still responsible for the fraud, and it counts against your fraud rates. So again, this is an additional tool in your toolkit that you can use, but very important to make sure it's one part of a layered approach in your overall fraud strategy.
Yeah, and I think that's worth stressing that it is very much part of that layered approach. It complements other tools that the merchant might already be using. It's not intended to be a replacement, and should ideally work in conjunction with those tools. Again, working closely with your 3DS provider and other fraud solution providers is critical.
Yes. So we just wanted to leave you with, before we get into the Q&A, because we do want to leave time for that. I do see some questions coming in. Wanted to leave the audience with what are some questions that you should be asking your 3DS provider as you're evaluating who to use? So one key thing is, does your solution support both 3DS 1.0 and EMB 3DS? And that's very important to call out because as the market's adopting EMB 3DS in 2.1 and 2.2, there are still a lot of issuers who are still leveraging 1.0. So if you want to implement 3DS, it's important to make sure that you have a provider who can support all versions of the protocol, because you don't want to be pigeonholed into just one particular version. You want kind of full frontwards and backwards compatibility.
Right.
Yep. So next, how does your solution handle protocol routing between 1.0 and EMB 3DS? So this is a key thing, because you as a merchant, you don't want to have to handle all of the protocol routing and trying to understand what issuers are on what version. Your 3DS provider should be able to do that for you. That's a key functionality that Cardinal offers within our solution, is that one implementation into Cardinal, we know what the issuers are doing, we know what version they're on, so we handle all of that routing behind the scenes. That's one of our key product features, is that we absorb that heavy lifting to make sure that our merchants and customers don't have to.
Yeah, that's critical, isn't it? So, and especially as we're going through this migration time period, when some providers, issuers are, let's say, not supporting the new specification, that protocol routing plays a key role.
Definitely. Another key thing to ask is, what implementation methods do you offer to support my various purchase channels? So we talked about, Cardinal has flexibility around JavaScript, API solutions, native application support. So as you're evaluating 3DS providers, make sure that they can account for all of your potential use cases. How are you addressing latency during authentication? So one of the key, KPIs from an authentication performance standpoint is, what is the impact to site performance? As we're working with our merchants and customers, site performance always comes into play. How long are the various calls taking? What does the user experience look like? So we like to make sure that as we're working with our merchants at a very granular level, we're giving them guidance on where to invoke the calls, to mask latency where possible, to provide the best customer experience. So it's very important that you call that out to your 3DS provider that you're evaluating and say, how are you going to make sure that you're providing the best possible experience from my customers? Another key thing is, what card schemes do you support on 1.0 and EMB 3DS? So not just the major players, MasterCard, Visa, American Express, but ELO, Carte Bancaire in France, JCB, Diners. Based on where you're transacting, these card schemes are very prevalent. So it's important to make sure that your provider is hooked into all these different schemes in order to fully support them. And then finally, how is your company, this would again be something you're asking your 3DS server provider, how is your company focused on optimizing the customer experience during authentication? So, we at Cardinal are in a unique place in the ecosystem because that's all that we focus on. So we don't have other, fraud products. We're not a payment processor. We're solely focused on authentication. So everyone that's a part of this organization is dedicated to making that experience better on a day-to-day basis. So it's important to ask someone that you're evaluating as a potential solution provider, what does your roadmap look like? What things are you taking into consideration to make sure that you're protecting, my customer's experience?
Right, and I think that's becoming more prevalent or more important as we move into these more mandated requirements that merchants need to have confidence that the solution provider is going to be able to meet their requirements, and then also on an ongoing basis going forward, support them.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Kevin. That's very interesting. And I think that brings us now to some questions that we have been receiving that we would like to answer. So looks like, just looking at a couple of questions here, somebody asked, is there a connection between the new 3D Secure and EMD chip cards? Well, in essence, the EMD chip card is specific to card-present point-of-sale transactions, whereas 3D Secure is focused exclusively on e-commerce transactions. We also have a question, is the new protocol, is it backward compatible? So if a merchant is on 2.1 today, then roll on a couple of years, there's new versions that have come out, what might they have to do?
Sure. So that's that's a key consideration, I think, that we talked a little bit about earlier, whereas you want to make sure that when you're implementing 3DS, you only have to really do one core implementation. So, for example, you implement into Cardinal's JavaScript-based solutions today. We're up to 2.2 right now. So you're certified and you're ready to go for 2.2, 2.1, 1.0. So you're fully, backwards compatible. Now, when the next version of the EMV 3DS specification comes out, version 2.3, there may be additional data points that are available. There may be additional fields that can be included. So there could be some incremental updates to take advantage of new features and functionality, but the core implementation itself is still going to support all of the previous versions of the protocol. So it's not we have to rip it out and re-implement every time there's an update or every time there's an update to the spec. It's more so just understanding what's the gap between 2.2 and 2.3, for example. What do I want to take advantage of in 2.3? And then you can prioritize the work to get that done.
Okay, so much more optional from the merchant's perspective. Is it in my interest to make the updates for 2.3 or whatever version it is?
Correct, and how they want to prioritize. And there will be, eventually when you're on EMV 3DS, there's going to be some limitation on how old of a version you can be on, and that'll be kind of dictated by EMVCo and by the networks. But generally speaking, that's accurate.
Okay, but just to stress that once you're on EMV 3D Secure, if it's let's say 2.1 or 2.2, you've done that heavy lifting work. Then any future version updates, it's relatively light work in comparison. Correct?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Okay, so we've got a question here. Are issuing banks less likely to authenticate a cardholder based on whether or not the purchases is considered a high-ticket sale?
Yep. So this plays into the risk assessment that the issuer does within their ACS, which is what they use for authentication. So the amount of the transaction definitely comes into play when an issuer decides whether or not to passively authenticate or challenge their cardholder. So that is one data point that is definitely a part of that decision. In 1.0, I think perhaps it played a bigger role in that sense. Whereas in EMV 3DS, there's all of this additional supplemental data that you can send in those messages, and you have the additional risk indicators and all of the other various fields and data elements that are available. So if you're sending as much data as possible and you're feeding all this other information into the issuer, then maybe amount won't come into play as much because the issuer has more other additional information to make a decision off of instead of relying so much just on, hey, this is a high ticket value or high ticket item and I don't want liability for it. They'll have more details to work with.
Okay. Got another question here. What is the enrollment process with the brands? Should a merchant go through an enrollment process? Is it different for each brand? I don't know if you're able to maybe lightly touch on that.
Sure. So that's definitely something your 3DS provider should be able to handle for you in majority and help walk you through. So there are enrollment processes with the networks for both EMV 3DS and 1.0. You have to be loaded into their directory servers. So, for the most part, we can handle that for you. There are some situations where your acquirer will need to actually run through the process of loading you into the EMV directory server. But your 3DS provider should be able to have that clearly outlined so you know what to expect and who needs to take what action, whether it's you, the provider, or the acquirer.
Okay, great. Another question. The listener is saying, I've heard 3D Secure 1.0 is sufficient to meet the PSD2 requirements. Is that true? And I think that's I think we were certainly hearing rumors about that, but I think the underlying message is that that really EMV 3D Secure is necessary for the merchant to ensure that transactions are going to be approved by the issuers,
Right.
and also minimizing the decline rate in essence.
Yeah, it has to meet the requirements of something you are, something you know, something you have. So the EMB 3DS version of the protocol has greater capability to support those things, and it supports biometric authentication and some other different authentication methods that satisfy the SCA requirements.
Right.
And probably more important is that the networks are mandating that their issuers are moving to EMB 3DS to support all of these features. So while 1.0 may technically work in some use cases, it's really the network saying, no, you need to migrate over because we need to ensure the best user experience is being presented.
Yeah.
And the right data is being sent.
Yeah, and that's the bottom line. And a good example of that is the native app that 3DS 1.0 just cannot support.
Correct, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, and I think we've got time for just one more question. So this question came in. You had mentioned 1 to 3 months might be the typical time frame for integrating or implementing 3D Secure. Are there key factors that influence that time frame?
Yeah, sure. So, we as a 3DS server provider, our implementation teams are able and willing to work as fast as our customers are. The actual development work and the coding is done by the merchant, and then we help configure and validate and test everything. So we're willing and able to work as fast as our customers are. It really depends on the complexity of the implementation. So are you doing browser-based and native app SDKs? What does your business look like? Are you a digital commerce only merchant? Are you brick and click? Do you have order management systems that need to get all of these data points passed around internally? So that 1 to 3 is nuts to bolts solution design to launch, and encompasses everything, not just the actual implementation of the authentication solution, but then also how you're passing data to all the downstream third parties, as well as your other internal source systems that you need to send the information to.
Okay, wonderful. So hopefully that gives that listener peace of mind. Listen, Kevin, I would like to thank you very much for your participation today. Very insightful. I certainly appreciate all the listeners joining in. And just as a reminder, March 4th, we will be hosting our next webinar. And as Kevin had mentioned, we're going to be focusing our discussion on key dates, timelines, for the preparation of the 3D Secure. So on that note, thank you very much, and wish you the best until then.